Welcome to World History. Today we're going to discuss the reasons that World War I happened, and we're going to guide you through the beginning phases of the war until it sort of settles into the comfortable stalemate that World War I is going to become, at least on the Western Front. So let's talk about what's led to this greatest war, or this greatest war up to this point in human history. And your goals for today are, by the end of today, you should be able to analyze the causes of World War I. You should be able to explain why Germany embraced the Schlieffen Plan and analyze why the Schlieffen Plan failed and then the results of that failure. So let's get started. World War I happened for a variety of different reasons, as you saw in our readings from previous. One of the reasons was the alliance system. So going all the way back to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, as you may hopefully remember, there was an attempt to create this balance of power in Europe. First, Clemens von Metternich trying to create basically equally powerful European states, with more or less the goal that if states are equally powerful, they're very unlikely to go to war against each other because they'll just both exhaust each other and neither side is going to be able to win, right? And so previously the goal had been to isolate France and to keep sort of the other European states at an equal level of power. Otto von Bismarck also carried this on, trying to make sure that Germany didn't become isolated, because of course lots of countries like England were getting somewhat worried about a rising Germany. So Otto von Bismarck, knowing that Germany is sort of in the center of Europe, it is vulnerable to attack from both sides, he tried to keep Russia within the German sphere of influence. But as the new Kaiser of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, started rising to power, he fired Otto von Bismarck, and then he ended up alienating the Russians and instead embracing the Austrians and Italians, creating this sort of central bloc here. These countries were known as the Central Powers, or the Triple Alliance. And then Russia, of course, England and France were united against Germany, and they added Russia in the early 1900s to become what's known as the Triple Entente, which is French for alliance, which is not super helpful. But when the war starts, they're going to become known as the Allied powers, whereas Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire are going to become known as the Central Powers because of their central location. So how does this explain how World War I happened? Well, all of these countries had mutual support agreements, which basically means that if two of these countries get into war, all the other countries have to jump in. And so the alliance system made it so that any small conflict could quickly turn into a very large conflict. Another reason that World War I happened was the naval arms race. As you hopefully remember from imperialism, if you don't have sort of the latest style of battleship fleet, you're incredibly vulnerable to just getting completely destroyed. And so as we saw, with the Japanese and their rising navy and the Americans and their rising navy, if you don't have these cutting edge battleships, if a war breaks out, your entire fleet can be decimated, and your opponents could potentially not even lose a ship. So when one side develops a new type of super expensive battleship, say the Dreadnought style battleship, everyone else is also going to quickly have to develop those, lest you find yourself outmatched, outgunned, and your entire fleet sunk. So we see the results of this on this chart from 1890 to 1914. All of the countries of Europe substantially increased the amount of money that they were spending, with obviously Germany and Great Britain and Russia being the greatest offenders here. And so all of this helped contribute to the size and scope of World War I because, one, the armies were just so much larger than they had been for previous wars. But secondarily, spending all of this money on armaments is not sustainable forever. Eventually, you're going to have to use some of this army, or you're going to have to decommission it, because permanently spending 120 million, or basically 110 million pounds a year on weapons is just not long-term sustainable. Then there's conflict in the Balkans, which is one of the things that led to the spark to start World War I. The Balkans is this region in between Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. There are these states: Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, Macedonia, things like that. And there was a series of different wars here where different countries were trying to pry stuff off the Ottoman Empire. These newly conquered territories were then, of course, trying to create their own nation states, because nationalism is, of course, an important cause of the war. So everyone wants to have their own nation state where their people can be protected/supported. And so because of that, Serbia specifically was trying to get more territory in order to create a Slavic nation state for the Slavic peoples, outside the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so there were several wars here as the Ottoman Empire starts to collapse, and Serbia tries to become a larger sort of leading power in the Slavic world. So the spark that started the war was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the nephew of Franz Joseph, the Austro-Hungarian emperor. And he was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist who may have had ties to the Serbian government, who was hoping to basically expand Serbia's power and get themselves out of the thrall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As his car was driving by a cafe, it stopped right in front of where one of the assassins was dining. And so a guy named Gavrilo Princeps, you don't need to know his name, jumped up and shot Franz Ferdinand in the face and also shot his wife. So he's now dead, and this creates an international incident because some Serbian state-sponsored terrorists attacked the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary. One of the other things that led to World War I starting was the fact that everyone knew that this war was going to take a relatively long time to get ready for. Because of the scope of the war, because of the number of shells, because of the ships that needed to be readied, because of the millions of troops that needed to be outfitted, if one country starts preparing for war, basically everyone needs to start preparing for war, because the amount of time that it would take to mobilize means that if you don't, another country could be invading you when you're not ready or prepared at all. And so because of this, once one country starts to mobilize, all the countries are going to have to start to mobilize, and then they're going to have to either fight or go bankrupt. So the thing that led everyone into war is now, so Franz Ferdinand is dead. Austria demands that Serbia give them access to their territory so they can perform an investigation. Serbia refuses, arguing that they are a sovereign state and Austria-Hungary has no right to invade. Of course, Serbia has no chance of actually standing against Austria-Hungary alone, but Serbia has long-standing ties with Russia on account of their common Slavic ancestry. And so Russia has seen itself as sort of the defenders of the Slavs for a very long time. And so there's some question as to, will Russia jump in to defend Serbia if Austria-Hungary tries to actually force their military in against Serbia's objection? At the same time, Germany pledges unconditional support to Austria-Hungary. And so with this alliance now cemented, Austria-Hungary now prepares to potentially invade Serbia. And so Russia, knowing that if they're going to respond, they need to start getting their army ready, mobilizes. They start getting their troops ready. They start getting the horses. They start getting the guns. Russia, of course, is this giant empire, as we see, that's somewhat isolated. And so even though they have allies, it's going to take them longer to get ready than anyone else. And so Russia starts getting ready, which, of course, means that everyone else also needs to start mobilizing. And so Germany demands that Russia stop mobilizing. Russia refuses to stop mobilizing, and so Germany declares war on Russia. Russia declares war on Germany, on Austria-Hungary. France then declares war on Germany, and World War I is now on. So who caused World War I? Man, that's a complicated, difficult problem and question to answer. The problem for Germany, as we talked about, is now they're facing a two-front war. A two-front war is a war where you had to fight in two different areas at the same time. And this creates some really obvious disadvantages. The most important one, of course, is you have to divide your army in two in order to fight on both sides, whereas your opponents are only bringing their army to bear in one place. So you're basically going to be outnumbered somewhere and probably everywhere. In order to try to overcome this, Germany came up with this plan called the Schlieffen plan. Knowing that they couldn't fight on both fronts forever, they obviously need to defeat one of these sides quickly. They realized that invading and quickly defeating Russia was basically impossible, and so they'd created this secret plan to try to invade and occupy France, thinking that if they could knock the French out of the war, they could then turn and deal with the Russians before the Russians overwhelmed them from the east. The problem, of course, is France and Germany had been at war a number of times recently, most famously the Franco-Prussian War. And so France had built a series of defensive forts along the German-French border that would really slow down the German army and prevent them from exercising the Schlieffen plan, which requires quick French surrender. So the Germans came up with this solution that they would march their army through neutral Belgium in order to take the French by surprise and hopefully overwhelm Paris. So they have to march into neutral Belgium and invade Belgian territory in order to carry out this whole Schlieffen plan thing. The Germans hoped that the Belgians would just stand by and let them go through, but the Belgians refused. The Belgians tried to fight. The Germans did crush the Belgian army, but it slowed them down. It caused significant Belgian casualties, and the assault on Belgium brought England into the war on the side of France and Russia because England had signed a treaty previously that guaranteed that Belgium would be neutral because they were worried that Belgian ports in anyone else's hands could be used as a staging ground to invade England. So Germany invading Belgium brings England into the war, and Belgian resistance allows France to mobilize their army and get prepared for the attack. So these two massive armies, some of the largest armies ever put together, meet in what's called the Battle of the Frontiers. And it's honestly not a battle like traditional battles where two armies meet and they fight decisively until one army is driven off. It's actually tons of armies across an entire front. Like basically the entire border between Belgium and France is the battleground for the Battle of the Frontiers. And what we see is the different philosophies of the two armies coming into play. The French favored speed, and so their troops were lightly armored with small artillery weapons, small guns, small stuff like that. They figured that if they were more lightly armored, they could move more quickly and be more flexible. The Germans favored somewhat heavier armor, helmets, and then also much larger artillery pieces. And this gave the Germans additional range and allowed them to set up a position where the French would basically march into German artillery fire. And so these massive German guns started tearing apart the French, and then a German counterattack followed, which then drove the French back. So after the French army was ripped apart or damaged substantially at the Battle of the Frontiers, we get the Great Retreat or the Great Chase, where the German army is chasing the French and British army back into France until they can find a defensive position. The German army sweeps through France, and over several days of incredibly difficult marching, they end up reaching right about parallel with Paris, where the French turn and make their stand. The great French general Joseph Joffre leads the French defense at the Battle of the Marne, and the French are able to find fortified positions to stand against the Germans and then rush in fresh troops from Paris in order to help support and fortify their exhausted armies. And so as reinforcements start pouring in from Paris, they break a hole in the German lines and the Germans are forced to retreat. This is, of course, especially disastrous for the Germans because their whole plan was predicated on a quick defeat of France. And now that hasn't happened, they're going to be clearly facing a two-front war because the Russians are already invading from the east. And so the German forces retreat back from the River Marne to the River Aisne. And on this side of the river, they dig in on one side, and the British and French dig in on the other side of this river. And what we get are the traditional battles of World War I, because the power of these new weapons, the machine guns and the mortars and all of this artillery, forces them to dig defensive fortifications. And so across the entire battlefront, from the British Channel all the way to the Alps, the British, French, and Germans dig these massive series of trenches with front-line trenches for soldiers to be in, support trenches for you to be able to move supplies in and out, reserve trenches where you keep your reserve troops to send up and to go in and fight, and then a lot of soldiers outside the trench that could be quickly funneled in if need be. They begin burrowing in. They end up building fortifications to survive these sort of fights. And then now, in order to assault, you have to cross no man's land here in the middle and possibly a river under massive amounts of fire, both from mortars and artillery, but also machine guns once you start getting close. In between the trenches, massive amounts of barbed wire were strung. Barbed wire, of course, was originally invented to keep cattle in the American West, but it becomes an incredibly important fortification in World War I because it slows down armies, because either you have to crawl through it or cut it, and makes them easy targets for riflemen, machine guns, and then, of course, the artillery shells. So barbed wire leads to shelling being increasingly effective. Both sides start bringing in more cannons, more types of shells, both explosive and shrapnel shells. And before every charge, usually there's a bombardment of several days to try to weaken your enemy. And so we see just these massive wastelands of craters as millions of shells were flung from one side to the other. And then we start getting the use of poison gas, which we'll talk about a little bit more next week. Poison gas, of course, is incredibly effective because it's a chemical weapon that can get into the opponent's trenches. But the problem, of course, is these sort of chemical weapons become incredibly difficult to control once you release them. And people are going to develop countermeasures eventually, like gas masks. But of course, it only takes a turning of the wind for this gas to move away from the trenches and hit your own troops, or also hit civilians. And so all of this led to huge casualty numbers. In the Battle of the Frontiers, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of men killed or wounded, which is bigger than most armies that people were fielding in eras prior to this. And so they're losing more men in a battle than most countries used to lose in an entire war. And so the number of deaths here is going to skyrocket, and is really going to affect the course of this war. So hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail, and then when we come back, we'll pivot over to talk about the experience on the Eastern Front.